Hello and welcome to E333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we are going to take a look at how we would export one of our objects. In this case, we're still looking at our user panel wrapper. Remember that it wraps around one of our users. And the idea is that we would want to be able to save the state of that user persistently on the file system. So the first thing that we want to do now is we want to switch over to the source. In an earlier video, we had looked at the import custom and import XML. We want to now add a couple of extra functions now that allow for us to export custom and export XML. In this particular video, we're going to focus first on the export XML, and then we're going, the export custom, and then we're going to focus on the export XML and import XML a little bit more in a separate video. To begin with, though, we want to go ahead and create a couple of public functions. What we want to do is we want to decide what the interface is going to be to our JPanel. In other words, what does the JPanel need at a bare minimum to be provided in order to be able to export a file. Remember that the JPanel, the user panel, wraps around a user object. Okay, so in other words, if you come up here, you'll notice that for a user panel already has a user, so it knows about the user. It's going to trust the user, essentially, the user object, to be able to know about itself and then the format that it needs to be saved in. So really the only thing that the user panel doesn't know yet is going to be the file name then that would need to be provided. And so what we want to do is we want to create a couple of additional functions. We're actually going to create two sets of them, both of which are going to be public, and they can be Boolean. And the first one is just going to be export custom, and it is going to be parameterless. And the only thing that we need to have here then is, of course, a results variable, which we are going to set equal to true, and then simply return those results. So we're going to continue with this pattern, and we'll change it as we see fit. The second function, which is going to be an overload of this, is also going to be a Boolean export custom, and it's going to accept a file. So it's going to be a java.io file, and we're going to call this one an output file. Now you could have also had an overload with a string, an output file string name, essentially, or you could have had an output file, a java.io file. Either is perfectly fine. We're only going to focus on these two, but you can clearly have additional overloads. In addition, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and stub in our public Boolean export XML. Once again, this one's going to be parameterless, and we're just going to go ahead and stub in the results return value, and then lastly then is going to be the public Boolean export XML, and this one is going to accept the java.io file and output file. So hopefully you can see the similarities here between these two sets of functions. We're going to start with the export custom, the essentially the parameterless one, and you'll see that effectively what we're going to do here is we're going to do much like what we did in an earlier example, in that we are going to leverage our ID to create our file name. Okay, so the assumption here is going to be that we actually have a valid user. So it's going to be how about if we say the name.user or the id.user file. Okay, so we're just going to leverage the ID. So the assumption here, so it assumes a valid user. So the first thing that we would want to do before we even ran this function is to check either for it being null or that its .status was equal to incomplete. And once again, we can improve on this as we go along. We aren't even addressing whether or not a user status can technically be changed. You would probably want to also consider verifying whether or not all the fields are represented. But the idea here is that somehow we want to do some basic error checking to see whether or not we have a valid user that can in fact be exported. Now, some of this can also be handled in the user class as well. So if you notice back to the user.java, when we exported a user, we made absolutely no checks as to whether or not the individual fields were populated or not. We just relied on the default values or what was provided by the programmer. In this case, we could also increase the checking here in our export custom and export XML. As a matter of fact, I would highly encourage you to do so because essentially you wouldn't want to export something if it was not complete, for instance. However, we're going to keep this one fairly simple. We're just going to make the assumption that either the user is not null or that the status is not incomplete. And then also notice down here under the export XML, we're essentially going to leverage the same principle by changing it to id.xml. Now, at that point then, after we've done our basic check, what we want to do is we want to construct a output file object, and we simply want to pass then that output file to the export custom. So the export custom without an input argument is going to then use the export custom that does provide one. So this is sort of a little bit of a different pattern than what we saw earlier. So let's go ahead and get this set up. We'll essentially work on the parameterless ones first. And so what you want to do is you want to start off with a if statement, and we can write the logic two different ways, but we're going to start off with if this dot user is equal to null, then do nothing, or basically return false. So then do nothing, results are going to be equal to false. And you can combine these statements, but I like to separate them out with an else if that this dot user dot get. All right, so we seem to have, no, let's see here. I seem to have missed something here. Let's close this parentheses and then else if this dot user, there we go. Not quite sure necessarily where my typo was here. Let's see here. My autocomplete seems to be failing me. All right, so we're just going to wing it here. Get status. And if that is equal to EE333.status.incomplete, then also do nothing. And more particularly, our results are going to be equal to false. But then what do we do if we've basically passed all of our checking? And by the way, just to be clear here, we would also want to do some additional checking beyond this. Okay. Now, if either of those scenarios are true, then what we want to do is we want to collect the information from the GUI before exporting. All right. So, which does lead us to an interesting question here. We need to check to see whether the status of the underlying object is incomplete. But shouldn't we perhaps also check to see if the combo value or the pop-up value is incomplete? So once again, it depends a little bit on the logic here of how we want to go about doing this. But another thing to also consider is if this dot J combo, all right, 1 second, my autocomplete seems to have stopped on me there. Let's see here, J. 1 second here. Let's see if we can figure this out. All right, it seems I didn't put my parentheses up here, and that seems to have caused our NetBeans autocomplete to have a hard time here. So J combo dot status, and in this case, we want to get the selected item or the selected selected item will be fine in this particular case. And then we can do a toString. And then what you would do here is you could leverage then that toString to do a compare to ignore case. And then in this particular example, then what you would do is you would leverage your EE333.status.incomplete.toString. And there's a couple of ways that you can go about doing this, but basically what you want to do is you want to compare the selected item in the combo box to the enum, to the incomplete enum, and if those two match, let's see here, let's make sure that we've got all of our parentheses matched up nicely. And if those two match, then we want to have results also equal to false. All right, let's see if we equals ignore case. I think, let's see if we can figure out where our missing parentheses are here. So this right here compared to ignore case, if that's equal to false. All right. So seems like we've got a mismatched parentheses here. Let's see if we can find it. All right, so just change the false then to 0 rather. I had false here. My apologies, a little too much time spent in the C and MATLAB world. In this case, that we just need to check to make sure that that's equal to 0, in which case then we essentially want to do nothing. And one thing I would suggest that you consider doing here is just simply providing then a pop-up box to the user, which we'll get to in a later video. But effectively, though, from an export functionality, we don't want to do anything if any of these conditions are met, whether the user is null, they're incomplete, or the pop-up box or the combo box thinks that it's incomplete. Now, how do we actually want to export then a valid user? Well, the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a temp user, or rather a temp file. So we want to create an output file, and it is going to be a java.io.file output file. And what we want to do now is we want to initialize it to the fabricated file name. So one of the things that we're assuming here, although we perhaps shouldn't assume it, is that if the user is null or the status is incomplete, we probably also should consider checking to see whether the ID itself is null. So I'm kind of assuming that in that if the user is not null, then the ID was successfully created, but that may not be the case, or for instance, that it may not be incomplete. So probably an additional check that would be useful would be to simply say else if this.user.id equal to null, and actually it would be get ID. And then probably just based on the logic that we talked about just a few minutes ago, we would probably also want to go ahead and say this dot J text box. So let's see here if we can, all right, let's see if we can figure out where we have successfully wounded our NetBeans autocomplete. All right, and then this dot J text. All right, it's not wanting to cooperate with me at all right now. Let's see if we can figure out where the problem is. All right, so if this, else if, all right, so it seems like what we've got is we've got one too many parentheses there. There we go. All right, so or this dot J text, still not happy. All right, finally. And then our jtext.id.get text. If either of those yield an empty string, then what we want to do is we also then don't do anything, so then do nothing. And the results are equal to false. So clearly you can see that this would probably be a place for you to prompt the user to provide an ID, something along those lines. But ultimately, though, we would collect the info from the GUI before exporting. So what I mean by that is we would update the underlying object. And so to do so, what we would do is we would say this.user.set, and then whichever one of the fields that can be set, depending on whether they are read-only or not. So this.user.set first name. And then what we would do is we would take the underlying JText, so this case, the JText first name, and we would get the text from that, and we would set the underlying first name. So what we're doing is we're taking what's in the GUI out of the GUI, and we are using it to set the fields in the underlying object before we export it. Okay, so note, we collect the GUI, collect the info from the GUI before exporting, and note, we would want to do some additional error checking here. In other words, can, for instance, the first name be empty? Can the last name be empty? And so on. All right, I'm neglecting that right now just to keep the video short, but this is where we would want to check each one of our fields. All right, so there's our last name. We can do the same thing now with our address field. The city. And now we start getting into interesting territory here, because now we have the state, which is no longer a JText field, but rather a JCombo. So there's our JCombo state. And what we want to do there is we want to get the selected item. And more importantly, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and use the toString. All right, so let's see here. And then the last one then is going to be the this.user.setStatus. But the difference here is that unlike earlier where it is a string, we have an enum here, okay? And so what we want to do is we want to figure out how do we pull the enum out of the combo box and then successfully change it from a string to a status enum. And so for a little bit of a hint on how to do this, we can actually go back to our user.java. And if we look at how we did this the first time when we were importing, so this is where we were creating our user, but rather where we were importing custom, what we would do here is we would set up this try catch that allowed for us to try a particular enum before setting the status. Now we can do this in a couple of different ways in a couple of different places, but since we are converting it essentially from a combo box string into a status, there's a couple of ways that you can do this. You can actually have the combo box leverage the underlying object, or we can simply just do another try catch just to be on the safe side. So in this particular case, since we're leveraging strings, you would go ahead and do another try catch. It is very unlikely at this point that we would wind up in a scenario where we would have an exception, but you just want to catch it just in case. And note here that it is a java.lang.legal argument exception. And so here we have java.lang.illegal argument exception. Let's see here, let's type a few letters here. Legal argument exception. And it's going to be EX. And once again, you can decide how you want to handle this. One thing that you can do here at the very least is just simply going to be a system.out.println, much like we've done numerous times before, of the toString for the particular exception. Now, inside of here is where we are going to simply use the value of function for the status enumerator to parse then the string for the currently set status in the combo box. So in this case, what we'll do is we'll say this.user.setState, or set status rather. And what we'll do here is we'll say EE333 dot status dot value of, and we'll pass to the value of the this dot jcombo dot status and the currently selected item. So get selected item, and we're going to use the toString method there. Once again, there's a couple of different ways that you can go about doing this. This just leverages strings, okay, rather than assuming that you have an underlying enum. Now, the question here becomes, what do you do with the exception? So in this case, what we could do is we could just simply say this.user.setStatus, and we'll just simply set it to EE333 status incomplete or even unknown. But then we run the risk of having an exception or handling an exception after we've made the decision as to whether to proceed. So my suggestion in this particular case is that we attempt to collect the status, since we're going to use this later on, before we attempt to check anything else about the underlying object. Okay, so there's going to be a couple of situations here. You could also end up throwing a null argument exception. So we'll want to see, we may want to capture that as well in our try catch. That would be a possibility, because effectively then we're checking for the status of the user after attempting to write to it. The other way that you can handle this is to simply use a temporary status variable, which would work as well. So you've got a couple of different ways that you can go about doing it. I would probably suggest also capturing a additional exception. So in other words, in addition to capturing the java.lang.illegal argument exception, that you also collect or capture a null argument exception. Now, assuming that this is this works, and assuming that you've already updated the underlying user for the status as well as the other fields, the first name, last name, address, and city, state. The other thing that we should note here is that we currently cannot update the ID. So note, we cannot currently update the ID. Why? Because it is private. Because it is private / read only. All right, and that's just a design consideration we want to make. So in other words, do you want to be able to change your ID after you've created your user? At this point, then, we simply create our file. So in this case, it's going to be our input file, or output file rather, is going to be equal to a new java.io.file. And to this constructor, what we want to do is we want to pass and concatenate the this.user.id. So it's going to be .get ID. And we want to concatenate onto the end of that the .user file extension. And at that point, then what we will do is we will simply pass this on to our export custom that accepts now a output file. So in this case, what we can do is we can simply say results equal to export custom, but this time to the overload that accepts the output file. And essentially what we've done here is we've passed on our functionality now to another overload. Now, the overload that accepts the output file then is going to need to do a couple of things in order to be able to successfully write to it. And to see what needs to be done there, we can simply go to our user driver.java and take a look at our export custom to understand what behavior needs to be captured here. So in addition to the output file, we also need a output file writer. So we'll start off with java.io.file writer. And to keep consistent with the previous example, I'm going to call it output file writer. And once again, we want to go ahead and do some of this now inside of a try catch, because of the fact that you could technically have an exception that being thrown. So we're going to try catch. And in this case, we're going to be kind of a little lazy. We're just going to accept a system.lang.exception Okay, so I have once again appeared to have killed off my autocomplete. All right, 1 second. Let's see if we can chase this down. I will be honest with you. Do not recall NetBeans being this bad about killing off the autocomplete every time there is a syntax mistake. All right, so let's see if we can get this to work again. All right, so I think we're just going to be stuck with calling it an exception until we figure out where the problem actually lies. All right, and then once again, we have system.out.println ex to string. All of this is old news at this point. Let's see if it's going to actually let me specify this. It's not being very helpful at all. So we're just going to leave this at exception. I'll go back and figure out exactly why it's giving us grief here. Notice, oh, it's I think I capitalized. No, system. It's java.lang. That was actually my fault. But either way, there we go. Java.lang.exception. I'm used to it sitting somewhere slightly different in the .NET framework. But either way, we throw our exception. Now, inside of here, we want to initialize our output file writer. So it's going to be a new java.io.file writer, and we want to specify the output file that was passed to it. Before we go any further, we want to remember to go ahead and close any open file that we have. And then from there, we simply want to write to the output file whatever the contents is of our user object. And we can leverage that using the export custom method on our user object. So output file writer dot append and we want to use this dot user dot and our export custom method. And at that point, then we should have successfully written, or we will be successfully writing a output file that matches whatever the ID is from the user. Now, the other option is, of course, that we provide a way to write or choose which output file to write. All right, so we're gonna leave it here and we're gonna test this. So let's go ahead and build it. All right, we've already built it. And then what we want to do now is we want to go ahead and run our user frame. We earlier in another video, we had left the code to forcibly import a user. What I want to do now is I want to go ahead and uncomment this temporarily just to test this. And then to see that our other function, our export function works, I actually want to say this dot export custom, no parameters. See if this will successfully take our sample.user and turn it into a gmyers.user. All right, and then to test this, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and start up our user frame. But before we do that, I want you to check your root directory in your user driver folder. And before we run this, make sure that you don't have a gmyers.user in there and run it. And as part of the constructor, it actually imports our sample user, and it also attempts to export it. Once again, we're just testing this. And now if you take a look at your user driver, sure enough, there is gmyers.user. Now, once again, this is not the ultimate way that we're going to go about doing this, but this just verifies that we have everything wired up. Now what we want to do is we want to be able to control the behavior either through the user frame graphically by pushing these buttons, or by calling a method from the user driver.java. So once again, hopefully you found this video useful. Before we leave this, I want to go ahead and uncomment this one once again, because in another video, we're going to show you then how to drive the form using another, drive the panel using another form or with the console. Once again, hopefully you found this video useful. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me.